Am I right that neither of them made news?
Well, neither of them really did anything you would have not have expected them to do. For instance, you knew that President Biden was going to go there and try to flip the script. He hasn't been to that part of the border. He went to El Paso last year, but he has not been to Brownsville. So he goes there and basically says, hey, we tried to get a bill passed. The Republicans made sure it didn't get to the floor. So now what he's trying to do is put the pressure on the Republicans. Republicans have been pressuring throughout this campaign about getting something passed when it comes to immigration. So now he's saying, OK, we did it. It's your move. As for the former president, Joe, as you know, he has visited the border many times, basically saying the same thing. He will be tougher on immigration, blaming President Biden for everything that's happening there now. So nothing unexpected really came out of today.
Well, how is it likely to be received by the Border Patrol agents that are standing there with the president, by others in Texas, that President Biden just says, look, I did my part in agreeing to this deal. It's up to Congress. I'm not even going to try to do anything else. There was no executive action or any other policy change announced today.
Well, listen, Texas is a red state. So in terms of Texas, I don't think anything President Biden said today is really going to make a difference in how people vote here. In terms of nationally, I think that there are some Democrats that have said he has to do more on the border. And going there today, at least, is him saying, I am paying attention to this, saying it openly, and saying, I want to do something about this. However, for the people that think he has not done enough on immigration and have been supporting President Trump or other Republicans all along, I don't believe him going today flips the script on that.
Just give us a sense of the geography we're talking about here quickly while you're with us, Julie. Donald Trump at Eagle Pass. We hear a lot about that. I think the way you termed that earlier is that's where the standoff is happening. How about Brownsville, where Joe Biden is today? We're looking at live pictures of him now.
Okay, so Brownsville is at the more southern part of the state. Eagle Pass much more in the center, as you said, more than 300 miles apart. Eagle Pass is really the standoff. That is where the federal government and the Texas Department of Public Safety have really come to a standoff in Eagle Pass there. When you look at Brownsville, Brownsville is a spot where there has been a lot of immigration and migrant issues in the past. Right now, living in Texas, you know there are certain hot spots for where there are a lot of people crossing the border. That is Eagle Pass right now. That is not Brownsville.
All right, Julie Fine reporting for us live from Texas. Thank you so much. Meanwhile, here in Washington, House Speaker Mike Johnson spoke to reporters earlier today, tying the border to government funding.
The obvious truth is that we have to take care of America's needs first. We have to. The border is the issue to every American, no matter where they live, no matter where their state is, because every state's a border state. If we're going to take care of America's needs first, that means two things. It means securing the border. I would repeat it 10 times for emphasis, but you understand what we're saying here. We have to secure the border. We have to do it. And we got to fund our government. And so this week we're working very hard to do both of those things.
So on that note, let's bring in Bloomberg's Michael Shepard. So, Michael, they tried to do one of those things today. The House did do their part, passing another continuing resolution, the fourth of this fiscal year. We assume that it is also going to pass the Senate. What is our degree of confidence that this is going to be the last stopgap measure we see out of this Congress?
If you're asking me whether I have a high degree of confidence in this being the fourth and final continuing or interim spending resolution, I don't place bets on that. I will say that they really would like to get this done. They realize that the more they kick the can down the road on spending, the more complicated it gets. We're in an election year. They have other issues that they need to get to, and they realize that the longer this drags out, the more of a pox on both houses, honestly. And Republicans, especially under Mike Johnson, have really been struggling to get their act together. When he took over as Speaker from Kevin McCarthy back in October, and you remember what a fraught experience that leadership fight was, he promised a well-oiled machine. And so far, we haven't really seen much evidence of that, as you just described, all these battles over spending. What they're stuck on right now is, one, they would like to see more spending cuts. They have reached agreement on the top line, but now they have to get down to the individual spending bills, and they just need more time to get through them. In part, immigration is one of the big issues. In part, another one is Ukraine funding. Right. Not tied to this, a separate matter, but it all gets thrown in together.
What makes us think that 2 more weeks makes a difference if we've not been able to figure this out for almost half of the fiscal year? I realize they might get these first 6 done, but when this comes time to start debating Pentagon funding, Homeland Security, the DOJ, what's going to happen?
Well, you're asking a very rational question. How are they using their time? And especially when, Congress is prone to leaving town and, taking the House just returned on Wednesday from a nearly 2-week break. And you would think that they could use this time to actually work very intensively to try to set up and tee up those bills to get it done on time. But the politics up there are very messy and very divisive. And it may not augur well for, the next spending deadline that we'll see for those bigger agencies come later in March.
Well, if they get it done tonight, lawmakers, after a 2-week recess, will have a 24-hour work week to show for themselves. Michael Shepard, thank you. As we turn now to the new Bloomberg News Morning Consult swing state poll, it's just out today, and it shows a majority of swing state voters think President Biden is too old. The same poll also finds a majority of voters in those same swing states that will likely decide the election think Donald Trump is too dangerous. Bloomberg senior editor Wendy Benjaminson is here now with that. I'm not sure which is worse.
Good question again. I'm not sure either. And the really interesting thing about the citing that Trump is too dangerous. So 59% of our swing state voters said Trump is dangerous, but more than a quarter of those are going to vote for him anyway. So who knows, maybe dangerous is not a bad thing in their mind for a U.S. president. Maybe they also, the same people found that he was a strong leader, that they trusted him on things like that. Whereas Biden, when we asked about character traits, President Biden got more people saying he was compassionate, cares about people like me. The really interesting thing, which shows the effectiveness of Republican messaging, is that voters are evenly split on whether Joe Biden or Donald Trump is honest. Which is sort of interesting. More on the Donald Trump being dangerous is that there were open-ended questions where the respondents were allowed to volunteer what they had seen, read, or heard about either of the candidates. And the people who cited him as dangerous, when given the chance, offered up his comments that he would let Putin do whatever he wanted if NATO countries didn't pay their bills to NATO, and that and cited the 91 felony counts against him. So that's where voters are seeing danger in Donald Trump.
Okay, so that's all the adjectives: dangerous, old, honest, take your pick. On the issues, though, we just saw both of these men making trips to the border today. Is that what's going to make a difference in these swing states? What do we find on the issues like immigration?
It very well could. I mean, only one of our swing states, is actually on the border, is Arizona. The others go as far north as Michigan and Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. But the 2 issues that voters cite the most are the economy and immigration. As the economy begins to improve, though, you see that voters' concerns about the economy are going down while immigration keeps ticking up. It was up another 3 percentage points from just last month to this month as the #1 issue for voters. So Donald Trump and Joe Biden, their staffs read those polls. They send them to the border to try to do something about it.